See the blotches? Some drops of water have fallen on the page. These are some verses that Ludwig Wittgenstein copied into a notebook. The poem says, "Bitter tears stream down my face." The notebook is part of the recently discovered archive of Francis Skinner's papers. Ludwig Wittgenstein and Francis Skinner, that's Francis on the left and Ludwig on the right, were a couple during the 1930s. They lived together, they planned a future together, they made love. And they worked together on philosophy. Wittgenstein dictated his thoughts to Francis, and Francis wrote them down. After Francis died in 1941, Wittgenstein gathered up his papers and sent them away. They were forgotten for years. Recently, they have been discovered and published. In this clip, I'll be discussing the relationship of these two men and some philosophy problems they worked on. Wittgenstein was 43 years old and Francis was 20 when they met. Wittgenstein was already very famous. He was born in Vienna into one of the wealthiest families of Europe. He came to England at the age of 19 to study aviation engineering. That's Wittgenstein on the right with his kite, doing an aerodynamics project. Then he got interested in theoretical mathematics and logic, so he went to Cambridge to study with Bertrand Russell. Then came 1914 and the Great War. Wittgenstein returned to Vienna, enlisted, and was deployed as a forward artillery observer on the Eastern Front, an extremely dangerous position. Even in the midst of combat, he continued to think about math and logic, and he wrote his ideas down in notebooks. He used only the right-hand side of the pages for the math and logic. These notes have been published. On the left-hand side, he kept a private diary in code. The code has been deciphered, and now the left-hand pages also have been translated and published. Among other things, they record the many times he masturbated. After the war, he turned the right-hand notes, the part about logic, into a book and sent it off to Russell, who had it published. It was the famous Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus. Wittgenstein argues that there are some things that cannot be said, they can only be shown, and it ends with the often quoted saying, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." It was immediately recognized as an important work of philosophy, and when Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge in 1929, it was as a teacher. Here is what two people who knew him well at the time said about Wittgenstein. Bertrand Russell called him passionate, profound, intense, and dominating. And this from George Henrik von Richt. I believe that most of those who loved him and had his friendship also feared him. Francis was in his third year of college when he attended Wittgenstein's lecture in the spring of 1932. After that, they became inseparable. Francis was only 20 years old to Wittgenstein's 43. The Skinners were a distinguished academic family. Francis's father was a chemistry professor, and his mother was a mathematician. Unfortunately, he had a terrible illness. He contracted polio at the age of 12, and the virus infected the bone, a medical condition called osteomyelitis. It was chronic, and Francis was subject to attacks which required hospitalizations. He wore a metal brace on his right leg. But he was bright and hardworking. His mother and father were hoping for an academic career for him. This is a picture of pain behavior. It comes from the notes Francis took in one of Ludwig's classes. The man has a toothache and shows it by holding his hand to his face. During the academic year 1933-34, Wittgenstein and Francis both had rooms in the college and were rarely seen apart. Francis attended Wittgenstein's classes and took very detailed notes. After the Tractatus, Wittgenstein was never again able to just sit down and write philosophy. To express his ideas, he needed a listener, and Francis was an excellent listener. This particular series of lectures was about saying and thinking and meaning and understanding. I know what I am thinking, but I cannot read your mind. And how do I know you are even thinking at all and not acting automatically like a robot? Philosophers call this the other mind's problem. Pain is a special case of the other mind's problem. I directly experience my own pain, but yours I can only infer from what you do. What you do is the pain behavior. But how to know it is real? Suppose someone pretends to have a toothache, or an actor gives a toothache performance. So in addition to pain behavior, there is the private experience, the feeling of pain. And where does the private experience occur? You wouldn't want to say in the mind. After all, a headache is not a mind ache. And there you have the mind-body problem. After class, they would go to the movies. They sat in the front row, right under the screen. Wittgenstein's favorite star was Carmen Miranda. By 1935, they needed jobs. Francis's scholarship and Wittgenstein's fellowship both were running out in 1936, and they had to make a living. Wittgenstein was weary of the academic world. He was tired of clever people saying clever things. He wanted the life of a working man, so he decided they both should work as laborers. Francis had been spending all his scholarship years with Wittgenstein instead of taking the courses and writing the papers that would lead to a career in mathematics. He had no work experience and no job skills. Wittgenstein's solution was they would both go to Russia and be laborers. They began taking classes in Russian together and planning a visit to the Soviet Union. Their trip to Russia was planned for September of 1935, but Francis was ill and could not travel. So Wittgenstein went to Leningrad and Moscow by himself. The Russians received him warmly. They thought he was interested in dialectical materialism and offered him a teaching job. But that was not at all what he wanted. He wanted to be a laborer. However, the Russians did not require any laborers and declined to provide the jobs or the visas. The clock ran out on their academic grants, and they had not found work. This was 1936, the depths of the Great Depression. That summer, Francis got a job as a mechanic at the Cambridge Instrument Company, a factory making scientific instruments. The job was grinding blanks into screws on a lathe. Hot, repetitive work amid deafening noise. He took lodgings above Moton's Provision Store at 81 East Road in Cambridge. And while Francis was machine tooling screws, Wittgenstein left Cambridge and Francis and went to live in his cabin in Norway. He had had the cabin for years and went there so he could be alone. But when he was alone, he was lonely. His biographer, Ray Monk, read Wittgenstein's coded diaries for these years and quoted them at length in a 650-page biography. I would like to live with somebody, Wittgenstein wrote, to see a human face in the morning. He told his diary that he really appreciated Francis only when he was away from him. And he said, "How unique and irreplaceable Francis is, and yet how little I realize this when I am with him." Francis had no such confusions. He wrote to Ludwig, "I think a lot about our relation. Are we going to act independently of each other? What will happen if there is a war? I long for you often. I love to think about you." And he said he did not want to be in Cambridge working at the factory. He wanted to be with Ludwig. This is Wittgenstein's hideaway, a cabin on a mountainside overlooking a fjord. Zoom out and you see the climb to get to the cabin. Zoom out again and you see his tiny hut perched on the enormous mountain. He stayed there until late 1936. Then he went to Vienna, escaping the coldest, darkest Arctic months, but he was back in 1937. In August, he invited Francis to come to Norway. Francis couldn't travel because he was having another operation, but in late September, he joined Ludwig. While waiting for Francis, Wittgenstein was not sleeping well. because of sensual fantasies, he wrote in his diaries. And then when Francis finally arrived, Wittgenstein wrote that he had been sensual and indecent with him. In his 650-page biography, Ray Monk quotes this from the notebooks. Lay with him 2 or 3 times, always at first with the feeling that there was nothing wrong with it, then with shame. Have also been unjust, edgy, and insincere toward him, and also cruel. Monk adds, whether this was the only occasion on which he and Francis were sexually intimate, we do not know. It is certainly the only occasion mentioned in his coded remarks. The Norwegians have restored his cabin and maintained it as a monument. You can see what a challenge it would be to bring in provisions. How do you suppose he got a water supply up there on those rocks? In any case, the visit was only 2 weeks. Francis went back to Cambridge and factory work. Wittgenstein was back in Cambridge in March of 1938 when Hitler annexed Austria, the Anschluss. After the Anschluss, he was no longer an Austrian citizen. He was German, and according to German racial purity laws, he was Jewish. To get British citizenship, he needed a job, so he gave up his dream of being a manual worker and returned to teaching. Ludwig moved in with Francis in the lodgings above Moton's provision store. For the next year or 2, they lived together, Ludwig teaching classes at the university and Francis toiling at the factory. In the spring of 1939, Wittgenstein gave a famous course on the foundations of mathematics. The lectures were attended by Alan Turing, a brilliant graduate student. Turing's challenges brought out the best in them both. This was only 10 years before Turing published his breakthrough paper on the mind-body problem by asking, can machines be intelligent? The question we now have to live with as we make friends with our chatbots. Francis no longer working with Ludwig on philosophy problems. Ludwig moved into rooms at Trinity College. They were both living in Cambridge, so they didn't write letters, and Wittgenstein doesn't say much about Francis in his journals in this period, so we don't know much about how their relationship was going. We do have some clues. At one point, Wittgenstein was worried because he hadn't heard from Francis, and he wrote this, thought, it would be good and right if he had died, and thereby taken my folly away. Although there again I only half mean that. That is not the same thing as wishing him dead. But Wittgenstein clearly felt threatened by sexual intimacy with Francis. And there is this letter from Francis to Ludwig in October 1939. Francis wrote, I feel very unhappy that I should have given you cause to write that you feel I'm away from you. It's a terrible thing that I have acted in a way that might loosen what is between us. It would be a catastrophe for me if anything happened to our relation. Please forgive me for what I have done. We don't know how Wittgenstein answered. This might be a turning point or only a momentary blip in their relationship. Love is mysterious. It's the other mind's problem. On Friday and Saturday, October 3rd and 4th of 1941, German bombers attacked the Wellington Royal Air Force Base near Cambridge. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Francis was having one of his osteomyelitis attacks. On Wednesday, October 8th, Wittgenstein brought him to the hospital. Every bed was full. Francis was put on a cot in a corridor. Wittgenstein stayed by his side. He stayed with him Wednesday night and Thursday and Friday. It was not until Saturday, October 11, that the head nurse got around to Francis, and she immediately called his family. By the time his parents arrived at the hospital, Francis had died. The death certificate notes that Wittgenstein was present at the death. People said Wittgenstein behaved like a wild man at the funeral, and when he returned to the college, he was in a state of nervous collapse. On the very day of the funeral, he wrote a resignation letter to the university. Next, he collected Francis's papers and sent them off to a friend. This is the archive recently discovered and published. There was an exception. Wittgenstein gathered up his own letters to Francis, the ones Francis had saved, and destroyed them. The letters Francis had written to him he kept. One of the archive items is a notebook where shortly after Francis's death, Wittgenstein copied some Russian verses. The verses are from Pushkin. Probably he and Francis had read them together when they were studying Russian. The handwriting is blurred in spots that look like drops of water. It is not unlikely the smudging is caused by teardrops, the editor says. Here is a translation. When night shadows descend on mute city squares, that's when the torture starts. And during the night, pangs of remorse rise up in me like serpents. Fierce, bitter tears stream down my face, yet the words I cannot wash away.